It's really, I am very happy and thankful to the Aesthetic Project Trust that they have. Uh, it's a wonderful journey to be with them and be a part of the exhibition and the wonderful seminar they have organized. I'm really thankful to the Renu Judge and the Kavita ji. And it was a surprise when I got an invitation by Kavita ji that you will be a part of conversation on the diamond. So I thought it's not my subject. And except that I have worked on the Nizam jewelry, I have handled all the jewels, right from the mending to the display stage, and not once, at least 4 times. So only that experience, I don't have much interest and knowledge about the diamond. But when I saw the Susan's name, I immediately accepted because she is a very good friend of mine. And I think more than 3 decades we know each other. And I know her personally and academically, what kind of a writing she does, whether you look at the Sikh kingdom of Sikh art, jewels of India, the paintings, the Tipu Sultan and Bidri ware, whatever work she does so meticulously, and she put up her submissions so beautifully that really it's a wonderful, yet another delight to hear from her on the diamonds. And I will not stand behind the Susan and diamond. I will just request Susan Strong, please come and take to the world of diamond.
Thank you for those very kind words, and I have to begin by thanking sincerely the Aesthetics Project, Kavita and Renu particularly, for inviting me to come here to this really wonderful conference. I think the standard so far has been exceptionally high, and I hope it doesn't sink now. I have to say also, it was a surprise to me when Kavita said, can you talk about diamonds? Because as with Anamika, it's not something I know a vast amount about, but like Anamika, working in a museum like the V&A, you do have the extraordinary privilege of handling jewellery of exceptional quality. And in these pieces, you find that diamonds form a path from the Deccan to the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is my own special area. And out into the world. And so it's really the story of the trajectory of diamonds from the Deccan that I'd like to talk about, but also the position of diamonds within gemology in the subcontinent. Until the 1720s, when the Portuguese exploited the diamond mines of Brazil and enabled these stones to enter a global market, India was the major source of diamonds to the world. There were and are alluvial deposits in Borneo, but these are too small to have had a wide circulation. And in the Indian subcontinent, there are also, of course, diamond deposits in different regions, including the Mughal Empire. But the most significant diamond mines were within the historic boundaries of the Qutb Shah Sultanate, founded in 1518. Omar Khalidi, in his book, Romance of the Golconda Diamonds, notes that the name Golconda really refers to the Eluru group of diamond deposits, including the famous mines of Koror and Patiala. And he estimates that between the 16th and the 19th century, there were nearly 30 mines in operation. They wouldn't all have been in operation simultaneously, though. Some would have been exhausted fairly quickly, it seems, from the evidence of the texts. One of the major routes by which diamonds left India in the 16th century was through Portuguese Goa, which was the centre for the trade in precious stones from the Indian subcontinent. And Golconda became the preferred name by which diamonds were known, even though the exploitation of deposits in the region obviously preceded the Deccan Sultanate by many centuries. In 1867, the spectacular discovery of a large diamond close to the Orange River in South Africa led to the Kimberley Diamond Rush, and the trade was changed forever. South Africa overshadowed the diminishing Indian and Brazilian stocks and became supreme. And since then, major discoveries have been made in different countries in Africa. There are deposits in Russia and Australia and Canada. And if you're interested in following it up, an accessible source which describes all this is the latest edition of Ian Balfour's book, Famous Diamonds, first published in 1987, with preliminary accounts of the famous diamonds of the world, but it's been considerably revised and added to in subsequent editions. Despite all these diamond sources, the name Golconda is still used in the trade to enhance the allure of stones, even when it's fairly certain that they don't come from the mines of the former Indian Sultanate. In modern gem testing, the finest colourless diamonds are given the classification internally flawless type 2A, meaning that they are the most chemically pure and often have exceptional optical transparency. These were first identified as originating from India, but later discoveries of type 2A diamonds in other regions, not least South Africa, demonstrate that they're not unique to Golconda. However, gemological reports on type 2A diamonds submitted for certification to the most highly respected gem testing labs will often state something on the lines of diamonds of this type exhibiting an antique cutting style as well as superior quality are very rare and will most certainly evoke references to the historic term of Golconda. Now, the careful wording is deliberate. These aren't categorically from Golconda, but the romantic association of the name gives the diamond an allure that internally flawless type 2A just doesn't have. So, given the historical preeminence of diamonds from Golconda, this isn't surprising. Some of the most famous diamonds ever known were cut when Persian was still the overarching language of court histories in the subcontinent, hence their Persian names, the Darya-i-Nur, or Sea of Light, and obviously probably the best known diamond in the world, the Kohinoor, or Mountain of Light. And I'm just putting up here something to amuse you while I talk about the next bit, which doesn't really have pictures to go with it. But this is a detail of a bazuband which came from the Mughal treasury, is now in the Hermitage. It went via Iran with Nadir Shah, who took it out of the treasure of India in 1739. But you'll see these prominently displayed, prominently set Golconda diamonds. Now, in the age of colonialism, there was a vogue for giving diamonds the names of those who bestowed or received them. So the Arcot diamonds were given by the Nawab of Arcot to the English Queen Charlotte in 1760. The Pigott diamond got its name from Lord George Pigott, the governor of Madras, and so on. Almost all these famous large stones, when they reached the West, were recut. And this will be a recurring theme in this talk, that the evidence for historic Indian diamond cutting is very hard to find. The famous stones which survive have rarely been analysed by trained gemologists to see exactly how the cutting was done, but as we'll see later, when this sort of analysis is carried out, it yields extremely interesting results. India's wider source of diamonds were often in alluvial deposits that were sifted rather than mined in the strictest sense, but those in and around the Deccan Plateau were the most productive. In 1677, the Englishman Henry Howard claimed when he gave a paper in London that the diamonds from the Deccan were sufficient to furnish all the world. And these sources were clearly exploited at a very early date. Any author writing about Indian jewellery in general, and diamonds in particular, will quote the Arthashastra or Science of Material Gain, written by Chandragupta Maurya's Prime Minister Kautilya in the early 4th century. And even at this very, very early date, early 4th century BC, we learn that there was a well-developed trade in precious stones and that these were found in the treasuries of rulers. The superintendent of the treasury received precious items, including diamonds, which in the text are listed after ruby and sapphire, and that's a point I'll come to in a minute. Diamonds, the text states, were found in the mine, the stream, and miscellaneous other sources. The most valuable diamonds are those that are big, crystalline, and brilliant, and these would have the octahedral shape of the natural crystal, which you see here. The various colours mentioned by the author include those that are similar to cat's eye or to the urine of a cow. The author describes the most desirable qualities to be sought in diamonds if it was big, heavy, capable of bearing blows with symmetrical points, capable of scratching a vessel, revolving like a spindle, and brilliantly shining, then it was deemed excellent. If, on the other hand, it had points lost without edges and defective on one side, it was bad. And the author emphasizes the need to exercise strict control over the trade in precious stones, including diamonds, as well as over the taxation. Early treatises are not precisely datable, but certainly predate the arrival of Islam in the subcontinent. Gemology was clearly very well developed. In the text, there are often sections on grading standards and the mention of experts. In the West, it was known that diamonds came from India from very early times. The knowledge was known early on. Pliny the Elder, in the 1st century AD, may already have known of the particular properties of the stone, that the exceptionally hard, the hardest of all stones, diamond, can be cut only by another diamond. And the medieval trade in precious stones from India is mentioned in many sources cited by Ronald Lightbound in his magisterial book on medieval jewellery. Ronald Lightbound was a former colleague at the V&A, the keeper of metalwork. And one of the more evocative eyewitness accounts that he gives was that of a Spanish knight and pilgrim called Pedro Tafor, who in 1437 saw a vast Indian caravan passing by the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. It passed endlessly before his eyes. It carried spices, pearls, and precious stones, which at this period must certainly have included diamonds. At Suez, the caravan divided. It went to Cairo and Alexandria in one direction and Damascus and Beirut in the other, so their wares were split into their respective markets, and Cairo Bazaar in particular was fabled for its precious stones. So you have this early, very populated route of precious stones and particularly diamonds to the west. By this time, knowledge of cutting stones had also reached Europe. Lightbound concludes that until the 14th century, diamonds were mounted uncut, though they might have natural points, and Navina showed yesterday a Roman ring with that kind of stone in it. By the 1390s, there's evidence for the cutting of very, very rudimentary motifs in diamonds, so little stars or a cross that required little technical sophistication. But the art of diamond cutting may have reached Italy by 1410, and in 1434, diamond cutters are specifically included in the regulations governing goldsmiths and jewelers in Venice. Contemporary writers now are divided in their views about how knowledge of diamond cutting came about in the West. Some suggest that the technology reached Venice from India, directly or indirectly, or that it went the other way, from Venice to India, neither of which have been clearly substantiated. It's a subject which seems to be in need of a great deal more research, but on balance it seems to me much, much more likely that the direction of travel of this knowledge was from India to the West. However, whatever the case may be, by the early 16th century it was definitely known in Europe that Deccan was the source of the diamonds, even if it wasn't fully understood what Deccan actually signified. Lightbound quotes the comments of a Venetian friar called Francesco Suriano, who wrote in 1514, "In the kingdom of Deccan, a very noble city, is a mountain where diamonds are dug. This mountain is 3 miles from the city by the shores of the sea." So what did the inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent, and specifically those living in the Deccan, do with these diamonds? How were they viewed in relation to the highly sophisticated gemological traditions that they would have been steeped in? In the past, authors such as Opuyuntract and Usha Balakrishnan, both distinguished jewelry historians, have described the extremely complicated symbolism of precious and semi-precious stones as described in these early Sanskrit gemological texts, and particularly the significance of the Navaratna setting, the 9 gems, which, as you know, correspond to the 9 celestial objects. So pearl signifies moon, ruby always at the center is sun, emerald is Mercury, and diamond is Venus, and so on. But in more general books, whether dealing with the Rajputs, Maharajas, dealing with the Mughals, dealing with any aspect of settings where, elite settings where jewelry is worn, there seems to be an implicit assumption that all jeweled ornaments made in the subcontinent should be seen within this single framework of these Sanskrit treatises, regardless of the cultural or religious background that's being dealt with. But it seems to me very questionable that these were the major influence on Muslim courts. Gemology in the Islamic world was also extremely sophisticated, and it seems unlikely to the point of not being possible that the Persian genre of Jawahirname, the books on precious stones, which absorb earlier Arabic and Greek traditions, would have been unknown in both the Deccan and in the Mughal Empire, given the extremely high level of literary knowledge, the movement of Iranians to both areas, and the economic importance of the gem trade within the subcontinent and beyond. Therefore, I'd suggest that there's a fundamental difference in the way that precious stones were perceived by the Muslim elite in the subcontinent, and that this also strongly influenced what was worn. From the Islamic treatises and from the clear evidence of Mughal sources, and from European travellers and the few surviving early Mughal pieces, it's clear that the gemological hierarchy is very different. The stones which have precedence are not those of the early Sanskrit treatises, and I'll explain this in a minute. But where the Deccan's concerned, we have a fundamental problem, because one of the major sources of evidence in the Mughal Empire is the very detailed paintings. So we can see from the early 17th century exactly what was being worn by the emperor and by the princes, not so much by the women, for obvious reasons. But if you look at this picture of Ibrahim Adil Shah in the British Museum, and if you had a very sharp eye yesterday, you would have seen in many of the paintings of rulers and the elite in the Deccan, there is a basic problem. They are not wearing much jewellery. Therefore, we can't interpret very much from a picture like this. We don't have the visual material. We certainly don't have pieces from the period. And as far as I understand it, I'd be very pleased to be corrected. There isn't as much or any historical information. There must be some, but there isn't much historical information in the histories of the Deccan about precious stones. But I would be very pleased to be corrected on that. Now, if we compare this Deccan jewellery with the Mughal picture, you can see it's completely different. Jahangir here is absolutely covered in very large pearls, spinels, rubies, and not yet too much evidence of diamonds. But a glimpse at the sources from the Islamic gemological literature seen in the 12th century Persian text is provided in a 12th century Persian text, which includes a section specifically on almas, or diamond, which has been kindly translated for me at my request by Surem Malikian. The text notes that diamond is called hira in the language of India, Bezabane Hind, and the different types are white, yellow, olive, zaiti, red, green, beige, and black. And the author says in every country they like and choose one of these. In Khorasan, they rate the olive ones and hold it as the most expensive and noblest. And he mentioned generally the gem cutters of Khorasan, that's the eastern Iranian lands, in connection with their colour preferences in diamonds. The author says that different regions like different colours, and so in these areas the prices would be correspondingly a bit higher. And the preferences of the gem cutters of Khorasan are different from those in Western Iran, those preferred by the gem cutters Hakka Khan, where in Western Iran they consider the best diamonds to be the yellow diamonds. And the people of India, Ahle Hind, consider the best diamonds to be these, yellow as well, for they have a good size and there are no faults in them. Two triangles make up a square when joined up. That shape comes about when it has been induced in the original nature. So that's the crystal that I showed you at the beginning. There is also a section in this text of the people of India testing colour by holding a diamond up to the sun and spinning it. And if the sun rays make the colours perceptible in a rainbow, then this diamond is their choice. He also notes the specific combinations of gemstones to be found in jewelled objects. Diamonds are associated with rubies and emeralds. And in Hindustan specifically, they associate red rubies and diamonds on seal rings. And you can see a glimpse of this in this spoon, which I think is unique, which is in the V&A, where you have emeralds and just tiny emeralds here associated with rubies, but you also have diamonds around the edge in tiny little chips, cleaved slices of diamond, and a rather larger diamond at the bottom. And so that seems to correspond with these texts. In the Deccan, we have very little information, but this seems to be associating ruby and, as far as we can see, emerald, but most of this is gold jewellery. It gives very, very little information. A much later picture of Muhammad Adil Shah of about 1675 is clearly under very strong Mughal stylistic influence. His turban jewel is certainly Mughal, though this looks much more Deccan-y. But again, you have the association of emeralds and rubies and probably diamonds set round here. I mean, these pictures sometimes need a certain amount of interpretation. There are the links between the Iranian world, specifically Khorasan in the east, and the Indian subcontinent in relation to diamonds are also mentioned by Yves Porter in an article on the Khalji architecture of Malwa, in the light of a manuscript written in 872 Hijri 1467-8, and this was a glossary of rare words and proper nouns occurring in Persian poetry, which was compiled in Mandu, and it includes a really intriguing reference to artisans who came to India from India and Khorasan as war booty. And these included the jeweler, the jeweler Muhammad Almas Tarash, that is, Muhammad the diamond cutter. So here you have an absolutely direct link between gem cutting traditions in Iran, which were clearly very well established, and the artisans coming into Mandu. There are references in historical sources to the wearing of diamonds in the Deccan, as in the Mughal court, which was such a spectacular market for all precious stones. And Karin Hofmeister, the Dutch scholar, who's written a lot of extremely good articles on diamonds, quotes the travel account of Jacques de Coutre, who was born in Bruges in 1591 and went from there to Lisbon and then to Goa with his brother Joseph, where they set up as gem dealers. And he wrote a very detailed report of the mine of Ramalakota within the Sultanate of Golconda, which is generally seen as the earliest foreign account of a diamond mine in India. And this is an account which was really not known until the 70s or 80s to scholars, but is a mine of, sorry, the pun, of information on jewels and the trade, and specifically on diamonds. But he also includes a few details about the jewellery worn by the elite and their animals. And he says that every morning, in Karin Hofmeister's quotation, a procession of nobles went to Ibrahim Adil Shah's court, mounted on elephants, which were decorated, the front elephants were decorated with coloured gemstones, and then they were followed by horses arrayed in gold and silver chains, set off with jewels, which he's very specific about, contained diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. The women had a jewel on the front of their head set with diamonds, rubies, or emeralds, and also had pearl or emerald nose rings, and were bedecked with necklaces of emeralds and rubies. And the combinations, again, are those mentioned in the Persian treatise. And this is an important witness account because he was a gem dealer, so he would recognize what he was looking at. But there are so few contemporary depictions of court jewellery, as I've said, it's impossible to be definitive where the Deccan's concerned. It's much easier to know what was worn and how stones were regarded at the Mughal court. And I've looked at a very great many paintings of the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan with a magnifying glass to look at these tiny details of jewellery. And in Akbar's reign, the details are really a bit too small and slightly too crudely done to be useful. But the larger scale of painting done for Jahangir and Shah Jahan afterwards allows these ornaments to be seen in detail. And I found almost no Navratana settings on jewels worn by the emperor and princes, and on the other hand, they do regularly, prominently wear jewels set with sapphires, an inauspicious stone in Hindu tradition. And when we get the pictures, I'll show you these. There are abundant references in Mughal histories to diamonds of enormous value coming from the Deccan, as you would expect, either as gifts or tribute, though the two were probably very hard to distinguish between. And other diamonds would have been brought from gem merchants either within the Mughal Empire, Agra for instance was a major gem market, or from the markets in Goa where the emperors sent agents. And it's, I would say, not at all an exaggeration to conclude that the role of the Deccan in supplying diamonds to the Mughal court was absolutely crucial in the projection of the magnificent imperial image, particularly under Shah Jahan, because it seems that fashions did change and that there was a greater influx of diamonds in the reign of Shah Jahan from the evidence of just of paintings, which doesn't mean to say that they weren't used before then. The histories of Jahangir and Shah Jahan both refer to tribute brought by emissaries from the Deccan, notably Bijapur, and as we heard yesterday, the Mughals were always trying to extend their empire into the Deccan, not least to be able to grab the diamond mines. But regular, lavish payment of tribute on behalf of the sultans became an effective means of defense. And Mughal spies obviously sent regular reports whenever there was a major diamond discovery. If a huge diamond came out, it had to go to the ruler. And in 1648, Shah Jahan's historian writes, it was represented. Can I change the slide now without? Yeah. So here we have Shah Jahan wearing here very prominently a sapphire, which was the point I was making earlier. And now we're on to where we should be, the tribute. And in 1648, Shah Jahan's historian writes, it was represented that a wonderful large diamond from a mine in the territory of Golconda had fallen into the hands of Qutb al-Mulk, whereupon an order was issued directing him to forward it to the Mughal court, when its estimated value would be taken into account as part of the stipulated amount of his annual tribute. He accordingly sent the diamond in question to court. In its rough state, and this is very interesting in the context of diamond cutting at the Mughal court, in its rough state it weighed 188 ratis, and after His Majesty's own lapidaries had cut away as much of the outer surface as was requisite to disclose all its beauties, there remained a rare gem of 100 ratis weight, so reduced from 188 to 100, which was then valued by the jewellers at 1,50,000 rupees. And this is a time when that sum of money would probably have purchased a princely mansion. So these are huge values of stones. In Shah Jahan's reign, there are many more references to large diamonds arriving at court, and the jewellery depicted in portraits of him includes many more diamonds. Sorry, I should have mentioned that, of course, this is from the Royal Library's Padshah-Nameh, the history of Shah Jahan's reign, which is looking back to the emperor's life as a prince, where here he's been welcomed by his father Jahangir after his successful campaign in the Deccan. And you'll see in the lower left these distinctively this Bijapuri ambassador carrying rich gifts, and almost certainly this would have been the occasion when they were handing over large amounts of diamonds as well. So Shah Jahan had many more diamonds, it would seem, and it may be, though this is a bit speculative, that there were more diamonds available in the mines at the time, because one of the early foreign eyewitness accounts of the mines in the Deccan comes from the English factor William Methwold, who writes that the mine he went to between 1618 and 1622 had only recently been opened up and was issuing very big stones. For the Mughal court, as opposed to any of the Deccan sultanates, we have a clear account of the place of diamonds in the hierarchy of precious stones. So Akbar in the late 16th century had 12 treasuries that lay at the heart of the efficient administration of the empire and were the foundation of its economic stability. The treasury for jewelled artifacts held items made at court, as well as tribute sent by rulers, but the treasury storing all the unmounted precious stones was the most important. It contained stones given or received as tribute, but others that were purchased or acquired as plunder. And what may be surprising to modernize is the relative importance given to each class of precious stones. In other words, the hierarchy that we see there. The jewelers divided every stone that came into this treasury into 3 groups, and the first group, containing the most valuable stone of all, had lal, that means spinel, the stones of Badakhshan, the red stone of Badakhshan. The second classification was for diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, and the third group in the treasury contained pearls. The spinels were mined in Badakhshan, a province far to the north of Kabul, and the rubies would have come from Burma. That's a detail of the Bijapuri ambassador. And so the rubies that would be in the treasury would have this wonderful deep red colour described in ancient treatises, Sanskrit treatises, as having the colour of pigeon's blood, and this was from Burma. Sri Lanka supplied the sapphires and other stones, but emeralds came from the New World. They were brought by the Portuguese from Colombia to Lisbon and then to Goa on their ships, which also brought pearls from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Persian Gulf. And Goa, of course, was the centre of an extraordinary trade in precious stones where taxes were very low. And so you have diamonds coming from here. They could go very easily across to Goa through Bijapur. They would be traded up into the Mughal Empire. Spinels came from here, and so on. So very, very busy entrepot for precious stones. Spinels, though, that were regarded so highly, were assessed according to the beauty of their deep carmine red colour and their size, lustre and transparency. And their value was much, much higher than any other stone. The first-class spinels were worth not less than 1,000 mohrs, a Mughal gold coin, compared with a minimum of 30, the highest value of all the other stones, including diamonds. And this particular stone was sent to Jahangir by Shah Abbas in 1621. It bears the titles of an earlier owner. Shah Abbas and Jahangir had their own names added onto it. And of course it should be pointed out that it would be diamond points that were doing these extremely fine inscriptions. So in Iranian culture, the red stones, spinel and ruby was seen primarily as a metaphor of sunlight, which was itself a metaphor of the divine in metaphysics and of the sublime in art. Red stones, whether spinels or rubies, were also essential as part of the royal regalia. The crown held over the head of the king when he was enthroned was a symbol of the radiate sun, and the red stones were perceived as mineralized sunlight. And in this picture from the Chester Beatty Library, you can see Akbar at the center, holding a crown which is set with probably spinels and diamonds, which he's handing to Shah Jahan. The Mughals followed this Iranian tradition in only very slightly modified form, giving preeminence to spinel alone as opposed to spinel and ruby. But although spinels were preeminent, obviously in this court, all precious stones were hugely appreciated, and Shah Jahan in particular was a very renowned connoisseur of precious stones. The sparkling Golconda diamonds played an essential role in projecting this incredible splendor. When foreign visitors saw here you have spinels and pearls and an emerald at the center worn by Shah Jahan. When foreign visitors saw Jahangir's wealth on display at his birthday weighing, they mentioned the jewelry. I mean, there are several accounts, but Jacques de Coutre, who I mentioned before, also went to the Mughal court. And his travelogue mentions that in 1618, when he went from Goa to Agra to chase a debt for pearls and precious stones, he saw the emperor being weighed for his birthday celebrations. And he says that he was covered with, this is a picture of Jahangir actually weighing his son, the future Shah Jahan, but this is the sort of ceremony that he would see. And he said that he was covered with so many precious stones from all over the world that he looked like an idol, and he had more jewels than all the monarchs of Europe put together. And the other visitors to the court, foreigners who were noticing anything that struck them as strange, unusual, or dazzling, corroborate this impression of overabundance, and this is supported by paintings. So large diamonds, like all other stones at the Mughal court, were cut and polished to retain the maximum possible weight. The symmetry preferred in the West, which involves considerable wastage, was sacrificed to this need to keep the weight. But exceptional skill was required to cut diamonds in this way to produce an extremely complex network of facets or to tailor the cut to the stone over the irregular shape. And this is a stone which is now in Kuwait. The mastery that's required of stone cutting is now rarely possible to be seen because, as I mentioned at the beginning, loose stones are almost always recut if they reach the West. And those set into vessels and jewellery, this is a very small perfume cup now in the Hermitage. This was one of the other pieces taken by Nadir Shah to Iran and then presented to Russia with an embassy. No museum, as far as I know, is doing any study of these stones which are embedded into objects. And if we were to do so, I'm sure we would find a lot of very useful information. Some diamonds obviously would have been cut before arriving in the Mughal treasury, and the French jewel merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who visited India 6 times between 1631 and 65, watched the diamond cutters at the Golconda mines, and he said, if the stone is clean, they do not do more than just touch it with the wheel above and below, and do not venture to give it any form for fear of reducing the weight. But if it has a small flaw or any spots or small black or red grit, they cover the whole of the stone with facets in order that its defects may not be seen. And he noted how skillful they were and said that if a stone had a kind of knot, such as is seen in wood, the Indian diamond cutters would not hesitate to cut such a stone, although our diamond cutters in Europe would experience great difficulty in doing so, and as a general rule would be unwilling to undertake it. Others in the Indian subcontinent were certainly cut by a very small number of Europeans employed by the Mughals. Shah Jahan, for example, had a Dutch diamond cutter called Abraham de Deutz in his service for at least 12 years. But we can be sure that all the Indian precious stone cutters were hugely skilled, because if you have a dagger like this piece in Kuwait, you have every little detail, including the eyes of these birds which face each other, are cut to fit the space. And this is only possible to set stones like this because of the indigenous Indian kundan technique. But here you have tiny little diamonds which are subservient to the main decoration, which is rubies, highlighted also with emeralds. Diamonds also down here. But extreme skill, not just in the stone cutting, but in the setting in these jewellery makers. The reason that when diamonds come to the West they get reshaped is because there's a fundamental difference of aesthetics. And this is exemplified in remarks made by the London diamond trader David Jeffreys in 1755. He wrote a treatise on diamonds and pearls in order to establish what he said, that he wanted to establish a rational set of rules for valuing them. But he had a particular emphasis on diamonds. And although Brazilian diamonds had now entered the London market, some of his comments are specific to Indian diamonds. And he has various incidental comments on the Indian market, including the fact that Indian dealers would, from time to time, withhold diamonds from the market if demand was slack, and that they sent their stones in sealed-up parcels, which were sent on trust, so that the price was established before they were left, and then the price was paid in England when they arrived. But his comments on stone cutting are very interesting because they illustrate why Indian cuts are always modified, or almost always modified. He says that for the rose cut, a round or circular stone, in his view the most beautiful cut, there are very, very precise criteria that he lists. He says that the diamond from base to point must be half the breadth of the depth of the base of the stone, and the depth of the crown must be 3/5 of the depth of the base, and the perpendicular from the base to the crown must be 3/5 of the depth of the stone, and the lozenges have to be equally divided by the ribs that form the crown. All the angles have to be symmetrical. Very, very precise. So we look at the sort of diamonds that Tavernier was seeing here, nothing like that. So you can imagine that when Jeffreys saw these stones, he must have been appalled because they don't go with his instructions, which must have reflected contemporary taste. And this is an actual Golconda diamond now in the Kuwait collection, which shows the beauty of the stones, but equally the fact that it's completely irregular. Now, when we get a chance to analyse a loose stone, it does show more about the skills of the cutters. And this is arguably one of the most famous paintings in the V&A. It depicts Shah Jahan in his 25th year. He's holding a spectacular turban jewel set with a diamond here. And in many years ago, there was a diamond that appeared on the market in 1985, which is now in the As-Sabah collection in Kuwait. And a convincing argument was made for this actually being the one in the turban jewel. It's very flat. It's of convincingly similar shape. If so, this was obviously also had previously been a tawiz. You can see it's pierced at the top for a pendant. But this would be normal within the context of the Mughal court and other courts, that you would reset stones. But this was, before it went to Kuwait, it was carefully examined by the gemologists Alan Jobbins and Roger Harding. And they described this 56.71 table-cut diamond, very flat, in the following terms. They said that the surface is step-cut, the upper surface, and the very large table facet is extraordinarily smooth and well-polished with an adamantine luster. However, it is not plain, but slightly curved, as shown by the slightly distorted reflections of window frames. The rear facets are very irregular, and so on. And they comment on the cutting of the rear facets that they may appear crude, but when the stone is viewed in subdued lighting, it displays an extraordinary ability to pick up any available light and reflect it brilliantly. And so this seems to me to show that the diamond cutters knew perfectly well what they were doing. They could adapt their skills to any shape of diamond. And this stone is extremely important because it's very likely to have been cut before 1617. Now, you can't have a talk on diamonds without mentioning the Kohinoor, and this is a replica of its original cut, because this is one of the greatest tragedies, arguably, in the history of Indian diamond cutting, that it was recut. And I'm sure you've read the various histories of the Kohinoor. There are many versions, many elaborations of the supposed history, all of which emphasize the difficulty of establishing a true provenance for stones of such renown, and that's not confined simply to diamonds. Myths attached to it are based on isolated references in different sources. If there's a large diamond in the texts, it's always assumed to be the same one, in the same way that large spinels are always, despite the different references, are always lumped together as the same stone. One version, described by Ian Balfour, begins with Babur, and in his memoirs, Babur refers to Peshkesh given to his son Humayun in Agra immediately after the Mughal conquest of Delhi. And it apparently came from the Lodi treasury. It came from the family of Gwalior, and Humayun spared the royal family and in return was given this diamond. Another version says that the diamond had before this belonged to Sultan Alauddin, who'd acquired it in the 14th century. It's well known, according to this account, that a gem merchant once assessed its worth at the world's expenditure for half a day. And Babur says, when I came, Humayun presented it to me, but I gave it right back to him. Now, another famous reference links this diamond with one presented by Humayun to Shah Tahmasp when he had to flee India, and so on and so on. But the problem was that when the stone was given to Queen Victoria, it was exhibited at the Great Exhibition of 1851 in a case. It was in very gloomy circumstances. It did not match its incredible reputation. And so in 1852, Prince Albert decided that, having consulted other people, that it would be recut into an oval brilliant. And this is a replica which was discovered. This is the original stand of the Kohinoor as it was presented in the 1851 exhibition, recently discovered by Alan Hart of the Natural History Museum in London, who gave me this picture. And Ranjit Singh wore it, as you can see, with 2 other stones, and then the stone was recut. Now, before it was recut, a mould was taken, and this has allowed recent research done by various people measuring every dimension of every facet, every angle of every facet, to recreate the original stone. And the measurements were done by John Hattleberg, and the replica was created by John Suchet, I think, Scott Suchet, sorry, using a diamond simulant. This has allowed Alan Hart and others to look at the stone and say that the cutting is actually, again, extraordinary. It avoids all the most difficult parts of the diamond, the hardest points, which were recorded, the fact that there are areas of relative hardness and softness in the diamond was commented on in 1852, when a professor said that when attempting to cut a particular facet in the recutting process, the diamond became extremely hot. There were fears that the diamond may ignite and fly, i.e. break up. So extremely dangerous process to recut it. But in recutting it, it destroyed this great testimony to Indian gem cutting. We don't know whether it was done in the Deccan or in the Mughal Empire. But the person who recreated it said that the sheer number of facets and the complexity of the Kohinoor is remarkable for its time, even more so when compared to contemporary European cuts, which again seems to me evidence for gem cutting technology going from India. Alan Hart was also able to calculate the exact availability and angle of the light that would have shone on the diamond at Crystal Palace. And he said that when it did catch the light, it had a spectacular display of brilliance. So its recutting was a major disaster. But to return to the Deccan, too little is known at the moment about the jewellery, as we've seen, that was worn. And I think there are instances in painting of jewellery which should be analysed. And I think that would be a very good PhD project for someone. And a survey of references to precious stones in contemporary Deccan sources also has to be done. This painting may suggest the reality of jewellery. It was done by a Mughal artist for Jahangir or Shah Jahan, but it shows that, in particular, I think that this may be a Navratana setting. And I just wanted to slightly backtrack to show the complexity of Deccan culture, and obviously Indian culture in general. But when you have an Islamic overarching cultural framework, it doesn't mean that you also exclude everything else which is happening. And so I think the slender evidence of the Deccan Sultanates is that you would expect that they followed overarching Iranian court cultural tradition in this secular space, and yet the indigenous traditions were also at the same time deeply embedded. And I think this is probably, perhaps on the limited evidence of painting, more marked in the Deccan than it would be in the Mughal court. But I finish with a picture of a bird which belonged to a ruler who was living beyond the Deccan but further south, Tipu Sultan, which may support this idea that there is much more intercultural, for want of a better word, more complicated things going on in the Deccan than perhaps in the Mughal Empire at this very elite level. And this is a bird which was on the canopy which topped the golden throne of Tipu Sultan. It was broken up by the British after the siege of Seringapatam in 1799. But the bird itself and the throne, the setting of Tipu Sultan's court, all conformed broadly to Mughal tradition. The court language, the official language, was Persian, though of course they were all multilingual, and Tipu Sultan projected himself absolutely unequivocally as a Muslim ruler, whilst at the same time using emblems and symbols that could simultaneously be read in different ways to the Hindus of the region. And I think it's very interesting to see that on the back of this spectacular Humar bird, the royal bird of Iranian tradition, hidden away and known only presumably to him, to the court jewelers and the elite, is this Navratana setting. And this is an unpublished picture, but it's soon to, I think, to go into our book, I hope, of the forthcoming jewellery exhibition at the V&A in November. But I think whatever conclusion we come up with, the situation is extremely complicated, and I was very amused by and pleased to hear Naman's conclusions yesterday, dismissing the jargon which tries to talk about things in terms of binaries and the other, which is an expression, thank God, which seems to have gone out of fashion. But I don't know what terms to use instead to reflect this veneer, this framework from one culture which at the same time absorbs all the others in the region. It's an extremely complicated cultural setting which I'm barely competent to talk about. So thank you.
Really, you have shown us such a wonderful journey of a Kohinoor and its replica and many other facets which we were not so aware of such a detail. And you have pinpointed many such questions regarding the diamonds, which is always in everybody's mind. Diamond dazzles everybody's mind. But nowadays it is either in the palaces and the books and the museums. We hardly come across to see such a dazzling diamonds. And you have recalled my many of the memories when we were working on the diamonds with the Nizams. And really, especially the bracelet you have shown with the Kohinoor setting of the Ranjit Singh, which really reminds me one of the diamond Bazuban, which is another armlet of the Nizam Shahi collection, which I have handled personally. And it was a part of 3 sets, one with the sarpage, the plume, and the sarpatti, which is a strip, and the Bazuban. And it belongs to one set of early Nizam Shahi collection. And it's really a kind of enamel work. It just recalled my memory of the Nizam jewellery. And I have seen when we were working on that Nizam jewellery, I got an opportunity to work with the jeweler, the government-appointed jeweler, Jain Cholera, who gave us insight to look at the jewellery. And he was telling us that the jewels, that as we all know, that's a hira and the hirak, which can't be hard, which can't be break, it's so hard. So sometimes the setting was changed according to the pattern's design and desire, as we have seen in the case of Kohinoor. So the diamond must be the early, of course, the Nizam Shahi collection, which is a bit late. But definitely it's a Qutb Shahi diamond, which has been reset in the Nizam's collection. So these kind of issues which you have raised, it's really relevant when we see the jewelry of the Nizams and other things. So what do you think that the setting kind of a process is done within the Mughal court or in the whosoever the positions? So these kind of a setting was, as per the, as you have mentioned, that Dutch was the artist who was cut. So you can just throw light of the European cutting.
I wish I could throw light on the... Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah. I think the problem is that people tend to concentrate on the references to the Dutchman in Shah Jahan's entourage, on the fact that Aurangzeb called a Venetian cutter to have a stone cut. And therefore, it's easy to say, oh, well, you know, they couldn't do it. I mean, they did these horribly misshapen diamonds. You know, they didn't know how to do it, which is so clearly not the case. But the problem is that, as you say, these old stones are constantly reset, and as they are in the West, but and also stones are recut in the West as well. But what we're losing with these recut stones is a whole history, and so we can't. And I've been travelling the last week with a gemologist colleague, and we've been hearing all sorts of things about what a trained gemologist can tell from these cuts, which I wouldn't remotely be competent to see. And if you don't have the evidence, if you don't have someone who is trained in gem cutting, looking at the stones, you can't begin to see the complexity of the situation, and it's very easy to dismiss the skills that are involved in doing it.
Yeah, it's a really complex history of the diamond, whether you look at the nomenclature of the diamond, because there are a number of sites. If you look at the ancient records, it mentioned the Vidarbha site, the Maharashtra site, so they were in the past, which got mentioned in the literature. And when we look at the entire the process of science in terms of gemology, it got mentioned in the Arthashastra, it got mentioned in the Ratna Pariksha, then the Ratna Pariksha, and Varahamira also mentioned about that, and about the Vatsayan. He also incorporated one of the sciences of geology, gemology, among the 64 sites. So that kind of when it got a mention in the literature so strongly, and we come across with so little in terms of germs, in terms of gems, it becomes a little question, what are these gems? When we were having the knowledge of cutting the jewel, the testing and defects, we were told in the text that there were how to identify, as you have mentioned, so how to test the gem, and such a vast kind of the literature we have. But if you look at the jewels, it hardly we come across. But the other angle is, as you have mentioned about the temples, can you throw light about the diamonds and the jewels which are in the temples, apart from the royalty?
I think I'd probably
so that's a very
huge able to do that, but clearly there's a vast resource there as well. But I think we shouldn't neglect the untapped resource of the Persian literature, because this gives you very precise information. And I mean, even the Persian histories that we know, that are very accessible, that are edited, translated, and so on, you can get a huge amount of information from that, but you've got to go back to the Persian, because in the translations, the technical words are often mistranslated. So lal is always translated as ruby. And therefore that disguises the preeminent position in Mughal court culture, and I presume in the Deccan, but subject to correction, of this stone. We wouldn't know if we didn't have if you go to the Persian text, it's blindingly clear. And so I think if you go back to the sort of material that Yves Porter has found, the translation that I mentioned, and there is a significant literature, that would give you a completely different perspective, but one that would be extremely valuable. And then after that, you've got to go back, as Jagdish Mittal was saying, the crucial thing is always to look at the object, always, and look at it from the perspective of someone who has a knowledgeable eye, not a kind of wishy-washy art historian.
It's really true. And it just opened one more idea to study the temple jewelry. When the Krishnadeva Raya has gifted the golden jewel with the diamond eye to the Tirupati temple, that's recorded 1582. And apart from that, if you look at the Tirupati temple, full of jewels, and we are hardly aware of the kind of treasures they have. And so many temples are there. And one more aspect, the vernacular languages, literature, we have not explored that area. So that's another area to work upon, as you have rightly mentioned, that number of PhDs can be done on this. And sometimes when we read, especially when I read the Deccan story, that how the Mughals, they tried to conquer the Deccan because of diamond, I wonder why the Sone di Chidiya. It should be the diamond ki chidiya. So much of diamonds we have come across with the literature and the literature. So maybe there are several questions regarding the diamonds.
Susan, thank you for a wonderful talk. I found that very enlightening. And like you, I suppose I come from the other side, which is that I know a little bit about Deccan art, but nothing about diamonds. So that was very helpful. Thank you. Just to ask about the other paintings you may or may not have looked at. There's a painting in the Edwin Binney III collection, which I think is probably in San Diego, which is in Mark Zborowski's Deccan painting book. And it's a drawing of Ibrahim Adil Shah with someone else appearing at a window. Underneath it has a Seyasat star, which I suppose Burton Page and others have thought of as a Mughal symbol. and it seems to tie roughly to the timing of Asad Beg, the Mughal ambassador's visit to Bijapur right at the turn of the 17th century. And in that account, I can't remember if it's in the published, the manuscript translation, and then obviously there's the original just down the road in the British Library Oriental collection, the Waqi Asad Beg, which is his account of the visit. And in that, he speaks about the disaster of going to meet Ibrahim Adil Shah, kept him waiting, it was very late in the day. Ibrahim was distracted by listening to ragas, so wasn't paying any attention, didn't seem to be there, and then was fascinated by the turban pin that Asad Beg was wearing, which had some association with, I can't remember, I don't want to say that boldly, but the Dini Halachi or something that had been at court that was very important and was obviously a gift from the emperor and a sign of status. So he wore it to sort of announce how important he was, and just to effectively sledge him, Ibrahim said, "That's a lovely pin, can I take a look at it?" He obviously didn't feel that he couldn't say no, so he handed it over, and then of course Ibrahim was somewhat hard of hearing and forgetful when it came to getting it back. And one of the great, I think, tragedies, unless I've misread it, my Persian's poor, so you should take a look at the text, was basically that in the end, Asad Beg left Bijapur without his turban pin. Grudgingly, I think partly the subtext, I don't know about Mughal court culture, was that he didn't want to appear back at court without it. And so it's interesting that this painting exists with someone who may or may not have been Asad Beg, looking a bit miffed at a window with a seistat and not a carpet under him, and then Ibrahim Adil Shah holding a turban pin. I can't remember which way around it is. It's part of the proffering. So I suppose that's an interesting example of the sort of swapping there. So I don't know if that's part of a whole kind of influx of, were there Mughal gems effectively coming south as part of the trade? And did that inform the actual jewellery rather than just looking at portraiture that was undertaken in the Deccan?
Well, I mean, that's an extremely interesting question. The fundamental problem, again, with Deccani jewellery is the lack of it in paintings. There is some. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't any. Turban jewels would be worn by the ambassador because at that period they were the prerequisite. They were only allowed to be worn by the emperor and the royal family. And so if the ambassador was travelling, he would be probably given a turban jewel so he could travel. Now, when ambassadors came to the Mughal court, for instance, the Safavid ambassador was given Safavid-style turban jewels by the Mughal emperor. Therefore, it's obvious that they were perfectly well aware of Iranian styles and could reproduce them. You'd expect that. Equally, when the Bijapuri emissaries came, they were given Deccani ornaments, and they're given their name. Now, exactly what form these names signify, I don't know. And at some point, I'll look at later, 19th century surveys of names, regional names of jewellery, to see if they retrospectively can cast any light on the subject. But I think, there was a lot of toing and froing. People were wearing jewels when they were travelling, so people would be able to see them and to copy them if they wanted. But then as now, they're regional. They indicate status, they indicate place, and so on. And so it wouldn't be surprising that they would be copied or presented. But the thing of giving the turban jewel and not giving it back seems to be a recurring theme in history.
Thanks, Susan. The lecture was very interesting, new information. But for my information, I would like to know, because I have come across a spec made for the Nizam, or spectacles for actual use, where actually specs like this could have been made. And the second question is, when did this inscribed stones started being made into the country? Because except for the Jahangir's one inscribed stone, which belonged to the Darbhanga Maharaj, we don't know of any other piece. And one more question after that I
think you're talking about, in fact, two pairs of spectacles, because there's one, yes, floating around on the market was one pair of spectacles where the lenses were made of thin diamond, and the other pair had lenses made of thin emerald. And they were being passed around, and obviously the aim was to sell them. And at one point it was being suggested that they were Shah Jahan's personal spectacles. Unfortunately, they seem to be set in what looked like Ottoman opera glasses of the late 19th century. That doesn't mean that the diamonds themselves wouldn't be earlier. But I think, I mean, technically, I think that it's unlikely that they're, from conversations I've had, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting what we've been saying, that the cutting of the stone is probably not earlier than the 19th century. So I'm not really competent to say, but this is the consensus.
Yeah, another question is about the Nizam's jewels. I had seen this exhibition, Anamika ji, 3 or 4 times when it was exhibited in the Salarjung Museum. And I found there was none of the pieces which was made earlier than the 19th century. This was not the Nizam's collection. This was part of the Nizam's family collection, which Nizam kept aside in case of emergency they could be sold. And most of them were big stones only set recently in the palace workshops. Only 1 or 2 pieces were early, but none of them was either Qutub Shahi or early Asafjahi period. I'm told the Nizam had several times more better jewels, and I don't know what happened to them, because I know some of the jewelers who were asked to value them, they failed to value them. That is as late as about 2000 AD, that they refused that, madam, we can't value it, and they were stored away. I don't know what happened to them. They were some really beautiful pieces.
Yeah, you rightly mentioned, sir. Hardly there is one set which Usha Balakrishnan, who has written the catalogue, and while discussing with the Joan Cholera, they mentioned this set belongs, especially the diamond belongs to early, and it has been reset. So that was my submission for that. And the enamel work which has been at the back, that reminds the Deccan speciality of that particular period. So, yeah.
But I'd thank you as well for that comment, because it was my strong feeling looking through the catalogue. I wasn't lucky enough to see the pieces, but it was my strong feeling that none of the pieces were particularly old. And so it's interesting to have a more connoisseurs.
A little footnote to that story. I interviewed, before she died, a woman called Iris Portal, who had been a great friend of Princess Niloufer. And Niloufer took her to an underground silo that the Nizam had built with trucks full of money and uncut jewels in case of an emergency. It was underground and guarded by Bedu guards, but no one had maintained it. And she said they threw back the tarpaulin, and it was literally a truck full of uncut stones. But no one had kept the trucks going, so the tires were flat. And the Bedu guards were sitting around drinking chai. So what happened to all that stuff, I don't know.
The impression that you get is very much that it was a treasury of precious, of stones. It wasn't a place where the jewellery itself was particularly encouraged, was particularly made and patronized.
And a second little story, when I was doing Return of a King, I got out Shah Shuja's autobiography, the Waqiyati Shah Shuja. And that has a story about a little-known Kohinoor moment when Shah Zaman, Shah Shuja's elder brother, the elder son of Timur Shah, was captured and blinded in one of the Afghan things. He thought that he was going to get blinded, so he had 2 stones that he was carrying on his person. He hid one under a rock in a river, it was a grand sapphire, and the second one he slipped into a crack, the Kohinoor, he slipped into a crack between 2 bricks in his prison cell. Subsequently he was blinded, and when Shah Shuja came back to the throne 20 years later, he asked his brother where he kept them. He told the story. He sent out search parties, and the Kohinoor was found being used as a paperweight by a mullah in the castle, sitting on. I don't think these stories have been told before, but they're sitting in.
Sorry, this is just a comment to something that you're saying, but also a little bit where you began your talk about the Golconda and the lure of the Golconda diamond. If you actually track Krishna Devaraya's Orissa campaigns, what he does, if you look at all the inscriptions and his 2 wives, which were shown in Omena's talk, the bronze sculptures at Tirupati, in the inscriptions, he literally names the weight and the size of every diamond he gives to every single temple, from Vijayanagara to Kalahasti to Visakhapatnam, Andhra Vishnu, and so basically what you get a sense of if you track all his inscriptions is that he is knitting a network of Deccan diamond mines and gods, and showing himself as a gifter, and his two wives are also shown as being gifters. And the senior wife generally gives the larger diamond, and the younger wife the smaller diamond. I mean, this is, you can fairly track this in the inscription that all through that area. The second question I have is it's deeply a question. It's about nature, not just of the materiality of the technical processing, but the affective power of the diamond. I have yet to really understand the meaning of the Sheesh Mahals in India, not necessarily in Persia, but that whole nature of light. When you mentioned that that stone was meant to capture a certain kind of hold light in low light moments, right? Actually, when you look at a lot of the Sheesh Mahals, like say the one in Dungarpur and other places, they seem to work so hard at using the available diyas and whatever, lamp lights, to kind of create these auras. So I just wanted you to comment, if you could, on anything.
I'm not sure I can, but I would guess that as it's an interior, it's creating an image of the world, but I don't know. So it would be stars and light. But I don't know if anyone else could make a more intelligent comment about this. It's a very interesting question. It's certainly worth putting, but I don't think I can answer it.
I just wanted to ask a question about when you were talking about the cutting, the differences between the symmetry of the European stones and the lack of symmetry. It's slightly odd in that a lot of the cutters from Persia, etc., that you talked about, that came to the Deccan and other areas, Islam in its visuals has a great deal of symmetry, and it seems odd that they would have, it seems aesthetically odd that they would not have continued that in the stone cutting. Have you got a comment on that?
We don't know who the cutters were. It's very likely that Iranians were there, but I think the overarching need is to preserve the weight. And so you don't want to lose too much to make it symmetrical, but it must be governed by very precise rules and techniques. So I think that the skill is there regardless. But the problem is that we just don't have the evidence. We don't know who the people were. We don't know what they were doing. We know we have drawings by Tavernier. We have some drawings of historic diamonds when they come to the West. They are asymmetrical. And I take the point completely about symmetry in architecture and everything, but it does not seem to be the case here. And certainly with spinel, which was so highly prized in Iran, again, there is no symmetry. It's preserving the size, absolutely.
Could I say something to that? Based on one of the very beautiful objects you showed that fantastic dagger, which had those 3 big spinels, which are irregular. And then they are surrounded by all of these stones which have been very precisely cut to certain shapes. So to be the wing of a bird or to be the body of a bird. And that shows, I think, 2 different aesthetics side by side. So there is definitely the reshaping of stones to any shape you want. And it can be, for example, the 2 symmetrical flanking birds that you were pointing to. But the big stones had to be left, as big as possible, just to get them to shine, but to let them remain as big as possible. And if you think of these as not things that are wrought by men, but also the second category, the irregular ones, as things that are wrought by God. So it's this miraculous, ajaib manifestation that God has brought down to earth, and you have to value what He has given and the way He has made it. And so you don't mess with it very much.
I just wanted to add that as Kavita was saying, the economy of using the material is very important in, I think, in Iranian world. So, if you look at Ayane Kari, the mirror work which is happening in the shrines and holy places, there, because mirror was something which was imported. And it could break in the way. So the use of small pieces of mirror in a symmetrical way. You know, it was a way to preserve it, to use the material. But of course, we like as Kavita was saying, the stone, the biggest stone, should stay. And then in that dagger, we have these small pieces, which might be, waste of the biggest stones that have been used in those points.
Design actually is there to highlight the main stones. The main stones form the focal point of the other smaller stones, which are used almost like paint or enamel. And indeed, the red and the blue, the red and the green are compared with enamel, and enamel is compared with ruby and emerald. Right?
Thank you, Sue. That was such an interesting talk, and Anamika ji, for all your points. I just wanted to ask you about, you know, this idea of tracking diamonds as they leave India has been going on since antiquity, and we know of evidence in the Roman period. Then we have a huge hole basically until, I don't know, much later it seems, because we don't know necessarily of actual datable diamonds that exist in the medieval European world or the medieval Arab or Muslim world. But I don't know, I stand to be corrected about that. That's part of my question. But I also wanted to just raise this question about the idea of a diamond, even if the diamond itself isn't known. Because from what I understand, the diamond, the medieval world in general, Jack Ogden is about to publish 2 sources that I hadn't heard of. I just thought I'd run them by you. One from the medieval Arab world and one from the medieval European world, which indicates that the idea of a diamond was known even if the diamond itself cannot be traced. And the idea being that the diamond was admired for 2 qualities. One, its purity, and the other, its hardness. And the quote from the medieval European world is biblical in content and likens the qualities of Christ to the purity of a diamond. That's an idea about a diamond and a simile. And in the Arab world, apparently, the hardness of the diamond, the fact that it couldn't be overcome by any other stone, was known and understood and admired in some way. So anyway, these are little fragmentary hints of the idea of a stone, which I think is something just I'm putting out to you. And also asking the question, sorry, that's a lot of questions wrapped up in there, but when you look at something, the elite level of diamond movements, I mean, when they're very grand diamonds going from treasury to treasury, you can kind of track them, right? But if you look at something like the Cheapside Hoard in London, and which has all sorts of stones from the 17th century, including tiny diamonds, is it the case that they were known, but in tiny numbers, they were being traded, but not tracked? I mean, you're not trackable. I guess I'm just wondering about how this idea and the status of the diamond and the idea of the diamond moves in relationship to its size.
I think they're all good questions. It's extremely complicated. I think we have in the audience Derek Content, who is an author who's just finished a book on rubies and is working on diamonds. So I think you'd probably want to talk to him as a trained gemologist and historian of precious stones. I think the gemological treatises in Arabic and Persian are obviously a major source that isn't used. And I'd refer you to Ronald Lightbound's book, actually, for medieval sources, because